have realized that story is powerful. Story is what binds us ever since, caveman time, sitting around a fire.
Welcome back to For Entrepreneurs by Entrepreneurs, episode 8. I'm Eric Verdi, and with us this week is Cliff Duvernois with Call of Leadership podcast. I've known Cliff for 4 or 5, 6 years now. This is his third iteration of podcast. Much like myself, he started out with a local podcast really for his community. Then he went on for Path to a Million podcast, which was basically, if you go back and listen to episode 2 of For Entrepreneurs, when I had Brandon on, he has his own podcast, and you got to go back and listen to that podcast before you listen to this podcast, because this is the next step, the next chapter. So Brandon explains how to get a podcast up and running. Go to Anchor, you do this, you do this, you do this. And literally from that podcast a few weeks ago that we released, I've had 3 or 4 people reach out and say, okay, I went back, I listened to Brandon's podcast, and I did these steps, and now I'm on my path to starting a podcast. So the premise from Path to a Million, which is what you did, Cliff, was basically a daily video that you stripped down the audio, and then you had a podcast, right?
Yes.
And so now the next step, he's just started Call of Leadership podcast, where his motto, his theme is stronger leaders make stronger communities, which That's I right. love, which Cliff and I are affiliated, good friends. Comes back to what I've started in Frederick, which is the Impact Club, where you have a group of like-minded individuals that make a community stronger by pulling together, by pulling your resources together. So Cliff, I want to talk today about, after you've started a podcast, how to do the next steps, how to grow an audience, how to potentially monetize a podcast. So that's the long intro. Cliff, thank you for joining us today.
Eric, I am so happy to be here. Thank you for asking to be on your podcast.
I'm super stoked. So before we get into the meat and bones of the interview, give us your backstory. I gave a brief overview, so I want you to go a little deeper.
Sure. So a little bit about my backstory. I tell people I'm a recovering engineer. That's what my official training was from back in the day. And I did that for a number of years. And then I got into, somebody showed me this really cool thing called the internet. Now, I just dated myself right there, because this is like the mid-90s, I want to say, when the internet was starting to become a big thing. And I don't know what it was, but when I saw the internet, I just knew that the internet was the next step. Everything was going to be done online. Software was going to be obsolete. The way we communicate would be obsolete. I remember as a kid watching these commercials on TV where they would show, off in the distant future, and some lady would be talking on a phone, and she had a little screen with her friend who was also on a phone. They could see each other. I saw all that happening. So I went all in on the internet, got really savvy as far as like building websites, how to leverage search engines, how to get your website to pop up in search results. But it wasn't until social media came around that I really started looking at how can I leverage social media now to be able to grow a business or be able to connect with people that are out there. And this admittedly was something that I really struggled with, because a lot of people on social media, they either put a photo up there that says buy my product, or they come along and post something like pelvic thrusting gerbils or something like that up there, just something goofy. And this is actually how I met you, Eric, but we came across the Agent Marketing Syndicate, where it was basically, it doesn't matter how big of an agency you have. It doesn't matter if you're a one-man show or if you've got a team. If you are able to go out and communicate the content of your character through stories that you can post online, then you've got a distinct advantage, because now people do business with people. So by understanding how to use story, how to leverage story, how to be able to get that to move forward, then inside of this Agent Marketing Syndicate program really helped to propel my marketing side of me, so to speak, forward, and be able to start leveraging and build connections, understand what makes a good story and how stories connect us all. So that is how I actually wound up inside of the podcast world, because to me, podcasting is I guess I would say the current step that I believe that anybody can use to get their story and be able to communicate it to the world.
That's great. So I think you said in that opening statement, leverage 3 or 4 times. I love it. I love that you use the word leverage, because you're leveraging, relationships, you're leveraging money, you're leveraging
Yes.
time. Like, the one thing that we can never get back is time. And
Yes.
you and I had talked in the pre-interview, with your podcast, that you'll record a 30-minute podcast and you'll leverage that asset. You'll turn that into 5 other pieces of content. You'll have written content, you might have video, you might have podcast, you might turn it into a blog post. So I love the leverage aspect of what you're talking about. So on your journey to helping others and to grow these communities, and stronger leaders make stronger communities, give us, you said you got an engineering background. Give us like what your superpower is, Cliff. Like, what is the one thing that you've done really well, or that you're learning to do really well?
Well, the one thing, ever since I was, as far back as I can remember as a kid, the one thing that I've always been obsessed with is story. Ever since I can remember. I was actually a writer as soon as I learned how to write. And I just remember, like, in Michigan in the cold winters when you couldn't go outside, that I had pen to paper. That's how I entertained myself. And I would build things with Legos like any other kid out there would. But I spent a lot of my time writing. I've always been obsessed with story. And it wasn't until maybe about 5 or 6 years ago that, living in Southern California, I'm probably exposed to the movie industry, reading a lot of scripts that people would write. And I'm like, oh my God, that is like cringeworthy. But every now and then, you run across something that's like really good. You go see a movie and you leave there and you go, wow, man, that movie just baked my brain. Or you can't put a book down. It's so what are those ingredients for those particular stories? And this actually started kind of like an internal quest, because I wanted to have that ability to be able to craft a story that would keep somebody hooked, that would keep somebody engaged. And interestingly enough, it seems like the best stories are the real life stories that are out there that people have to share. And so the one thing that I have focused on, especially now with the launch of my new podcast, as you mentioned, called Leadership, is trying to figure out how to craft the best story, tell something that is compelling, but take it to that next level. What is a story that is inspiring? What is something that somebody could listen to, that they could get knowledge from, or say, hey, you know what? If that person did it, I can do it as well. So that is the level that I'm shooting for. And I don't know if I'll ever get there or not, but it is something that I strive for, I work for in every single interview that I do.
So you're exactly right. With story, when you can bring the reader, the viewer, the listener, when you can put them on your shoulder and they're seeing what you're seeing visually, when you go and you hit your thumb with a hammer, you can actually see that. You can feel the pain. When you can bring the reader, the listener, the viewer into your world and have them seeing it through your eyes. Now they're hearing the story through your eyes, your words, but mentally they're envisioning their own side of the story. When I like you just said, when I go to a movie and it's something sappy or something about a grandparent or aunt or uncle or a friend or, whatever, you're putting yourself in that character's spot, right? You're putting yourself in that character's spot, and then you're emotionally invested in that character, in that story.
Yes.
So the better that you can get at conveying your story and putting other people into your character and the role that you want them to see where you're going, it's more powerful. I know that's a long answer, but so what impact or transformation has story had in your business, in your world? Like when you've gotten better at telling stories, when you've gotten better at writing, what impact or transformation has that had with you?
It's been completely transformative. I don't say that lightly, because now it's gotten to the point where, I have realized that story is powerful. Story is what binds us ever since, caveman time, sitting around a fire, telling stories, versus where we are today, where we can go see a movie or watch something cinematic on TV or read an awesome book. It's always that power of story. And so what it has allowed me to do then is when I'm communicating with people, I always refer to it as a story. I am no longer afraid. This was something that I learned in one of the marketing courses that I took, the 30-day funnel challenge, where a lot of times they try to explain something and they use all this techno babble, or they use all this jargon that people just aren't familiar with. They don't understand what that is. So for me now, it's taking a step back and saying, okay, how can I tell a story around this concept to be able to explain something that might be advanced, or something that I think is so simple, but the other person has no clue what it is that I'm talking about. So the power of story really has permeated everything that I do, from the creation of the website, from the types of content that I post online, from the nature of the podcast interview. It's always in terms of story. So when I say it's really like fundamentally changed how I view the world, I'm not kidding. It's everything. And some of my friends will even get frustrated with me because they're like, okay, Cliff, get to the point, when I'm talking to them. But I'm like, no, there's a story here. Let me share this with you. And, you're right, because story allows you, something you mentioned earlier that I think is critical, is that when you're telling a story, you're allowing that other person to stand in your shoes and to see it from your perspective. And by doing that, that builds a level of understanding that you just, in my opinion, would almost be impossible to get if you try to lay all this techno babble out in front of them.
So I know in the beginning of the intro, when I introduced you, I talked about podcast, and we would tell the listeners, viewers, how to grow a podcast, how to grow a following. And it's super important. And, Cliff and I talked for the first 14, 15 minutes here about story, which also can relate to any business that you're in. We wanted to give you a base of marketing, of branding, of storytelling that you can use. It doesn't have to be in a podcast format, but I want to dig deep now, since it's your third iteration, Cliff. So we've started a podcast. We've been with Brandon. We've gone to Anchor. We've gone through the steps of starting a podcast. Now, how do you go about growing following? How do you go about, and I know you have recently taken a course from JLD, John Lee Dumas, who you and I both follow, admire. He was like some god that I, listened to the first, he's on probably like 3,000 episodes now, but I listened to his podcast to figure out what type of questions and what type of structure for my first podcast. So tell us how to grow a following, how to monetize a podcast.
Sure. So the first element that I would say for being able to grow a podcast is, and I'm going to steal one of your words here, Eric, is consistency. Being able to put out content consistently, whatever that schedule might look like. And I know that when I took a look at creating the Call of Leadership podcast, my initial goal was to do 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And as I started developing it and I started reaching out to people to be potential guests, I don't know what it was. It was probably experience more than anything, told me to scale back. It's a lot easier to start off at once a week or even twice a week and then scale up, versus try to kill yourself to get 3 episodes out a week. And then all of a sudden 1 week you miss it and you can only get 2 episodes out. And then another week comes and you're only getting 1 episode out. And then the audience that you have built now, they don't understand, or they don't know when you are coming out with new content. When is it going to be released? So I took a step back and said, okay, I can consistently produce content. I can consistently do 2 episodes twice a week. That right there is probably the top key element that I would say to anybody. If you're going to produce content and grow an audience, you got to do it consistently, because when somebody eventually finds you, they'll stumble across you. They're either searching online, or a friend on Facebook will say, hey, listen to this great podcast. They will find your podcast. And if you've got gaps in there of a week or a month, if you're not delivering consistency, they're not going to tune in, right? We're kind of creatures of habit that way. I like the fact that I know that every single night when I sit down at 8 o'clock, we can turn on Netflix and watch the episode of a TV. I mean, it's like that's that consistent. So that's the first key step, is getting consistently putting out that content. The second thing that I would recommend for people to be able to grow your audience is, don't make it about you, make it about others. everything that I do when I create a podcast episode and I put it out there is all about that other person. What is that person bringing to the table? I very rarely say, I very rarely would say, you know, I had a great interview with this person. I am so glad that they're here. I. No, I is completely removed. And I'll actually, you know, put the name of the person, say, for instance, Travis was nice enough to give some of his time to the podcast. We talked about this, and this. You will not want to miss it because of these value points here. I link back to his foundation. I link back to his nonprofit. I link back to his business. And you can do all this inside of Facebook. It takes literally 2 seconds to do. But I tag everybody that's in there. So that way, you know, not only are they notified that they've been tagged, but now I'm getting that episode exposed to their audience as well. And then when I do that, when I come back and I post content later on, like we were talking about repurposing content, when I come back later on and repurpose the content, it's basically rinse and repeat. You know, I just launched this thing now where I'm taking 1-minute snippets of my podcast, and I call it a 1-minute snippet. And I'm posting those online and getting those out online, where all it is just me asking one question in 1 minute of them talking. Just something super short, putting it up there on Facebook in video format. So that way somebody's scrolling through their feed, they see it, it's a 1-minute snippet. You know what, I have 1 minute, and I tag them in there as well. This person talks about here, and this is the lesson that's learned, and things like that. So making it all about that other person inspires them to share it to their feed, to share it with their friends, to email it to their other friends, make it all about them. That's a great way to, I was actually looking today, there was somebody on my podcast who her and her friends are just super tight. And my one podcast episode, all I did was post a link onto Facebook, and between their likes, their comments, and their shares, that one post got out in front of almost 8,000 people. I was shell shocked when I saw that, but you can, you know, Facebook allows you to see those metrics on the back end. And because of so many people liked, comment, and shared it, boom, it was like 79-26 or something like that. I almost fell out of my chair when I saw that stat. I was like, this is incredible. So by making it about somebody else, you are leveraging them, you're leveraging their audience to be able to get their message out in front of other people and help their organization out. So the first thing I said was consistency. The next thing I would say is make it about them. Using those two techniques, and there's other things that you can do, like every podcast episode, I have the entire thing transcribed, and then I add that to the podcast page. That now becomes rich SEO content for the website. So if somebody goes to a Google search engine and types in, for instance, you know, Frankenmuth Bavarian Inn, which is a restaurant that I showcased on my podcast, but if they type it in, that episode's going to pop up, and it's say in this podcast episode we talked to the owner of the Frankenmuth, you know, Bavarian Inn. And so now I'm just able to leverage those search results inside of getting my content out in front of people as well. So those are the three big things that I do anyway. Some people don't go through the process of getting a transcript. I do it because it's fast, it's cheap, and like I said, it's rich SEO content. Not everybody's going to want to consume your content in a video format or audio format, so why not have it written? So those are the three key things that I focus on.
So how do you have it transcribed?
So I actually use a service called Temi, T-E-M-I, and it's about 25 cents a minute. And so I edit the entire podcast with the introduction song, my little advertisement bumper at the beginning. Then I have the entire podcast, and then I upload that complete audio file to Temi, and it takes maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It'll transcribe it, break it down into different speakers. So I say speaker 1 is Cliff, speaker 2 would be Eric, and I put, you know, Eric Verdi in there, and then comma, and then, you know, the name of your company. Again, really rich SEO content. Put that in there. It'll transcribe it out. I download it, copy paste it inside of WordPress. When I'm ready to launch the podcast episode, I launch that content with it as well.
I love it. I love it. So I haven't done that step. When we're done the podcast here, it goes out audio form, like all podcasts do. It goes out in video form on Facebook. But then I also put it on my YouTube channel.
Yep.
And I didn't know this until recently when I was searching ways to transcribe is YouTube has a transcription feature built in it.
Yep.
Now it doesn't have the back and forth, Cliff said this, Eric said this, but it does have the words in there. And,
Yep.
if you want to do it even cheaper, upload, I assume anybody that's going to start a podcast is also going to have some sort of YouTube channel. So if you are starting a podcast, Cliff and I would definitely recommend putting your content out there on different forms of media, YouTube being one. If you want to transcribe it on YouTube, that's a great way to get it done free. Now you're going to have to do a little bit more work on the back end. But Timmy is a great service too. So awesome points. So consistency, make it about others, and then multi-purpose or transcribe your podcast so you can show up on SEOs and stuff like that. And I love the idea of the 1 minute snippets. Now, is that you doing the editing, the cutting down, or do you have somebody else doing that for you?
No. So once again, this is, the whole thing about repurposing content. So there's a service out there that I use that's called repurpose.io. And so when I launch a new podcast episode, it's connected directly to my podcast feed. So the audio from the podcast feed goes into Repurpose.io. And then from there, what it is I use, they have a thing that's called a snippet maker. So by tagging certain, I guess to take a quick step back, what I do on my podcast episode is I go back when I'm all done editing, is I go back and I pick out 3 or 4, maybe even 5 key questions that I ask. And I remember, okay, so I asked this question at 10 minutes and 12 seconds. And then when I go into Libsyn, which is where I host my podcast episodes, is I put those little brackets, I do 10, 12, and I put the name of the question. Then underneath it might say, 1723, and then the next question, and then et cetera. When I do that, Repurpose picks up on those little time codes. It will automatically generate a 1 minute video snippet of the podcast. So it'll be like me asking a question of somebody, say, Eric, tell us where you grew up. And then for 1 minute, it'll be your answer to the question, which is usually extremely powerful. Then it sends that video over to the Facebook page in a draft status, so to speak. So then I can schedule that snippet to go out at some future date. So I might take your episode that I did with you, Eric, and turn it into 4 or 5 1 minute snippets, and then post it to go out 3 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, 12 weeks from now, 20 weeks from now, right? Just scatter it out there. So that way, every now and then in the future, when somebody opens up Facebook, boom, there's a little snippet reminding them that, hey, I interviewed Eric. Here is a link to his interview. So that way it gets eyes on it, because not everybody's going to be with you from the very beginning. As you grow your podcast audience, as you're making these new connections, as people are liking your Facebook page and you're developing new audiences, it's always good to remind people, hey, remember way back when. My very first guest on my podcast, just to give you an example, the very first guest I had on my podcast was a nonprofit. They run a cat shelter. So I went to Google and I typed in, when is National Cat Day? And it popped up and said October 29th. So I went into Facebook and I created a post for October 29th that said, hey, today is National Cat Day. If you didn't get a chance, here's this little episode that you can listen to. And I hit save. Now I don't have to think about it. So it's not like, October 29th is going to show up and these people on Facebook are going to say, hey, it's National Cat Day. I'm already ahead of the ball game, So by taking these little video snippets and using this Repurpose platform, and it's like $15 a month. But like you said before, Eric, another one of the things that it'll do is it'll actually take my audio and turn it into a video and shoot it out to my YouTube channel with all the show notes listed down below. And YouTube will take those little brackets that I inserted in there and make them clickable. So if somebody looks in the description and says, hey, I want to see an answer to that question, they just click on that number and YouTube will skip to that part of the video. So I'm trying to leverage technology, and that's my magic word for the day, leverage. I'm trying to leverage technology as much as I can to get the story and the platform out onto to get the story out onto as many platforms as I possibly can.
So are there any other tricks of the trade? I've got Timmy so far, and I've got repurpose.io.
Dude, I'm about adding value and you're getting value right now.
I'm going to go back and go to, after today, I'm going to go to repurpose.io. So the cool thing about when I had Brandon on here was, yeah, my first podcast was on Libsyn, and it took about 8 different steps to upload it and do everything. And it's, I mean, yes, you can make having a podcast as time, labor intensive as you want, or you can just get the content out there.
Yes.
And there, when you and I started our podcast 5-6 years ago, 4, 5, 6 years ago, it was a process. Now with technology, just like with repurpose.io, that would have taken 2 to 3 hours to go back, find the clip, cut it, edit it, add an intro, add an outro, whatever it is. Now, like with Anchor,
Yeah.
I don't have to use Libsyn anymore. And, I don't quite understand if I still need my Libsyn account or not with the old Advice Givers podcast. Like if I take that down, do all the podcasts come down? Do you know the answer to that question?
I do. And if you decide to shut off your Libsyn account, yeah, because that's where the actual MP3 file is hosted.
It's hosted.
When you put the podcast into iTunes and Stitcher and those places there, all they're doing is propagating that URL, that your feed, so to speak.
Your feed.
Apple
Your
doesn't
RSS
keep a
feed or
copy of
whatever.
your episodes, neither does Stitcher. That's all housed on Libsyn.
Okay, cool. So I won't shut my Libsyn account down. But now with the new one, I just go to Anchor, which is so cool.
Sweet.
So Cliff, I love this. Are you, I know we went a little deep. Are you teaching this to anybody else, or are you learning to grow your own? And who are you learning from? Are you teaching this to people?
So a lot of this, the answer to your question is no, I'm not teaching this to anybody. A lot of this right here is because there was some lessons learned from my first podcast, a lot of struggles that I went through because, I realized at the time, and I was very quick to espouse this, but I was very slow on the uptick of actually putting it into practice, was that, perfect is the enemy of done. And because I had such a high standard of what I wanted a podcast episode to be, literally it was, I used to, like, the entire time getting somebody onto the podcast, that was a goat rodeo in and of itself, because a lot of people were confused about, what's a podcast? Why do you want me on there? You're going to make me look bad. I don't know, whatever those problems were. But then when the interview was recorded, I'd always cringe because I would have 10, 12 hours worth of work in front of me for every episode. And I was doing it once a week. So what I did is when I knew I wanted to do a podcast again, because at its heart, I love podcasting. I mean, I listen to, I don't know, probably like 20 podcasts a week. And I listen to ones that are less than 10 minutes. I listen to ones that are 2.5 hours. I'm all over the map that way. I love podcasting. I think it's a very powerful mechanism to get stories out in front of people. And I think once this COVID-19 is all said and done, we're going to see a huge increase in listenerships as far as it goes. But how can I say this? I wanted to take those lessons learned and apply it here and be able to get this new version of the podcast out from those lessons learned. So in the new world, it's, good is done.
Right.
Get it to a certain level that you're satisfied with it and then move on. Don't worry about making it perfect. Nobody is going to notice that you left one in there. You don't have to take out and splice out every single one. If you leave one in, it's not the end of the world. Nobody's really going to notice. Things like that. So those lessons moving forward is what, kind of brought me to where I am today, to focus more on the relationship part, building the relationship with the people that I'm having the interview with, keeping that communication with them going. And like I said, step number 2, make it about them, right? Get it all out there and focus my efforts on what can I do to help them with their journey, with their cause, whether it's for profit or nonprofit, one of the two.
I love it. And yes, simplicity is the key. I had Jay Lieberman on episode 3, Jay, and
Yep.
he's all about simplicity and investing and investing strategies. And to your point, 85% in done is better than 100% in draft format and never getting out to the public. So
Yes.
and nothing that we put out, nothing that we do is going to be perfect. We're always going to want to tweak something, and we're always going to on whatever. But it's more important, in my opinion, in your opinion, Jay's opinion, is to actually get to the finish line, right?
Yes. Yep.
So
No, you absolutely, you hit the nail on the head, because I think, and I think about this often, I'm a huge fan of the 80-20 rule. And it seems like, 80% of the work requires 20% of the effort, but to take it from 80 to 100, that last 20% is actually what sucks up 80% of the time. Because by now you're down there splitting out all these little things. And because that engineering mentality was driving me, it's like, it's got to be perfect. It's got to be perfect. It's got to be perfect. There was no joy. I mean, I love the capturing the story, but the editing part was horrible. But the editing is where you actually tell the story.
right.
And I absolutely made that miserable on myself. And then, like I said, when I took this next class, the 30-day funnel challenge, and it was just Facebook Live, put it in front of you and then just go. What that did is, by doing that over and over, and I think I made it to episode 232, but by doing that over and over and over again, it got me to the point where I was able to accept my imperfections. And that was tough. That took a lot of work, because there was a lot of days where I get done doing a Facebook Live and I'm like, oh my God, I was horrible. I sucked. This was the worst thing ever. And then like maybe 2 hours later, I jump onto Facebook and take a look, and I have like 50 likes. And I had all these comments, and people are like, oh, wow, this is so cool. This is so great. So by forcing me to face that in those, doing those Facebook Lives every single day, where I couldn't go back and edit, I couldn't make it look nice. It was just real and it was raw, helped me to break that habit. So now there's actually joy. I'm editing the podcast episode now thinking, how can I make the best story out of this? Rather than, oh my God, I've got 12 hours worth of work to do.
Absolutely. So let's wrap it up there. Just a final note. You and I have taken a lot of marketing courses and classes over the years. I do think what you're referencing here, the ClickFunnels One Funnel Away Challenge, Russell Brunson and Stephen Larson is actually one of the instructors,
Yes.
along with Julie. But Stephen's really the main focal point of the 30-day One Funnel Away Challenge. I went through that course twice.
Sweet.
And that was some of the best marketing I've ever heard.
You know it.
That was incredible. So listeners, viewers, if you haven't, and maybe I'll put a little show link down at the bottom, but the One Funnel Away Challenge, if you are in business yourself, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a marketer, if you're a copywriter, make sure you check out that, because you will gain, I promise, and Cliff promises you, that you will gain knowledge that you didn't know from that challenge. So Cliff, any parting words? How do listeners, viewers get a hold of you? I know you're always accessible. If somebody needs advice on how to ramp up a podcast, would you be willing to help?
Sure. Yeah. If anybody's got any questions, they can always shoot them at me. The best email to get me at is cliff@callofleadership.com. Once again, that's cliff@callofleadership.com.
Awesome. Listeners, viewers, episode 8 with my buddy Cliff Duvernois of Call of Leadership Podcast. We are out.